It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Dell S2719DGF. This monitor features a 27-inch WQHD, that's 2560 by 1440 TN panel, with support for 155Hz refresh rate and adaptive sync. As usual, this video accompanies a longer and more detailed written review, which covers some aspects which this review doesn't cover. So really this is designed to accompany the written piece and give you better visual representations of certain aspects. As usual, for a video you have to remember that what you see depends on my camera, it depends on my video editing software, on YouTube, and ultimately on your monitor, so it doesn't accurately represent how the monitor looks firsthand. So the WQHD resolution gives you a good amount of useful desktop real estate on the 27-inch screen, so things are a nice readable size for most users without any scaling, and you get a nice amount of space for multitasking. So you can be working on a document like this and also looking at a website, or you can multitask in whatever way you feel comfortable, but it's certainly better in that respect than a full HD model. You get a lot more useful workspace. The pixel density also delivers good clarity, good detail levels. It is a comfortable pixel density, a good pixel density, not extreme, but pretty decent, and that's sufficient to give also a nice crisp look to text. And this model also has a light matte anti-glare screen surface with a smooth finish, and that prevents light shades appearing grainy or like you're looking at it through some sort of dirty window, which some matte screen surfaces give. And I'm going to look at the external features of the monitor. So as you can see, the stand base has an interesting design. It's not sort of the usual rectangle, but it is nice and shallow. It doesn't take up too much depth on the desk, so you can push it quite close to the wall. The screen surface is light matte anti-glare, so that means it does handle glare quite well, but it also doesn't give an overly grainy look to the image. It actually gives a very smooth look to the image. It has a smooth finish to it as well as being a light matte anti-glare. So the implications in terms of image quality are explored elsewhere in the review. It has a dual stage bezel design, so when it's off like it is now, the monitor appears to have an extremely thin bezel. It's actually the hard outer plastic component you can see there, but if you look more closely you'll see that there's also a panel border around where the image would be, but when the monitor's on you can see that more clearly. You'll also notice, or you might notice, there's a little mark, what appears to be a little mark in the top right corner. That's actually completely normal. That is a little calibration mark, which is used by the machine that puts the monitor together and the panel together. The OSD controls face downwards beneath the bottom bezel towards the right side, and they're explored in the separate video, the OSD video. There's also a little shiny blue Dell logo. It's not too shiny, it's not really eye-catching. If light's shining on it directly you'll be able to see sort of a little bit of a glint, but it just has a kind of cool blue look, metallic effect. And the bottom bezel, as you can see, is thicker than the top and sides, so it's what's called a three-side borderless design, or dual stage bezel as I prefer to call it. So the bottom bezel doesn't really have much of a panel border to speak of. So you can see, as I was mentioning before, there's a panel border at the top and sides, whereas at the bottom the bezel pretty much covers that panel border. The included stand is fully adjustable, so you can tilt the screen backwards and forwards a bit. You can adjust its height. You can also swivel it left and right, but that's very difficult to do with one hand because it's not a very heavy monitor. You can see that the base itself just swivels, but it actually uses a turntable mechanism there, and you really need one hand on the base and one hand on the screen whilst you're swiveling it, which I can't do whilst holding a camera, unfortunately. And you can also pivot the monitor into portrait. And you do have to make sure that you sort of tilt it backwards whilst doing that, otherwise you'll scrape the desk, which isn't nice. So you can rotate it 90 degrees clockwise into portrait, as shown there. But being a TN model, you have to be aware that the viewing angles are quite restrictive in this orientation, so you get an obvious, the vertical viewing angles become horizontal, and it has a very obvious sort of gradient between the top and bottom of the screen in terms of brightness, and the colour reproduction changes, and it's not really very practical to use TN models like this, but you can do it if you need to. At the side there's not really much to talk about. The monitor's quite slim. You can see the fully adjustable stand as well. It's reasonably robust. As I said, the monitor itself's fairly light for a monitor of this size, and it doesn't have a huge stand. It's not particularly heavy, but it certainly does the job, the stand does. At the rear, the monitor is primarily the same colour which is used on the stand base, and that is what Dell call Recon Blue, or at least did in their initial marketing material. So it's sort of difficult to see in pictures and the videos, but this is actually a cool grey, so it's kind of a slightly bluish cast grey tone. So it's a slightly unusual colour. It works quite nicely, and it's mixed with black, so you can see sort of the usual matte black plastic in the middle there. There's also one of those shiny blue Dell logos. It appears to be a bit brighter actually, the one on the back compared to the one on the front, but it has a bit of a shiny quality to it. The included stand attaches using a quick release mechanism, so you press that button there, you can quickly detach the stand, and that reveals 100 by 100mm VESA holes for alternative mounting. I've got the monitor in portrait now just so it's easy to show you the port area. There's an AC power input, so it has an internal power converter, this monitor. There are two HDMI ports, and one is 1.4, the first one there. The second one has a sticker, at least on my unit it does, telling you that it's HDMI 2.0, and it's this second port which will support 144Hz at the native resolution, and it also supports AMD FreeSync. Next there's a DisplayPort 1.2a input, and that supports adaptive sync, so it can be used for AMD FreeSync, and as explored in the review, it can also be used for G-Sync compatible mode on NVIDIA GPUs. There is a 3.5mm audio output, there's a USB 3 upstream port and two USB 3 downstream ports. There are also some extra ports, and these are easily accessible from the front, so they're at the bottom of the monitor, and you can connect two further USB 3 devices to this, and then a 3.5mm headphone jack, so that's just for easy access. And you can see the first port there actually has a little icon next to it, and that means it supports BC 1.2 fast charging. So just something I left off before. Near the bottom of the stand neck there is a little loop there. It's a cable tidy loop, so you can slot your cables through that and it just keeps things together, so it's a bit neater than having cables flailing around all over the place. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. It has a TN panel, as I've already mentioned, and the static contrast is a little bit below 1000 to 1. It depends on the adjustments you have to make. The adjustments made to my test settings, it takes the contrast down a little bit, but it's still above 800 to 1, so it's more or less as good as you can expect from this panel type. And it doesn't deliver the kind of depth and atmosphere you'd get with a model that has much stronger contrast, such as a VA model, but it does still deliver a reasonable experience, and it doesn't have any IPS glow or anything like that towards the corners, so some users will certainly like the absence of that. But being a TN model, there are some perceived gamma shifts, and this means that even when you're viewing the monitor from a normal viewing position, and I've got the camera set up more or less to simulate this, so rather than having the camera completely central, I've actually got it mounted so it's looking down slightly at the monitor, and that would simulate the ergonomically correct viewing position, which would be with your eyes in line with the top third of the screen. And what you'll see is, with these perceived gamma shifts that exist with TN models, you'll notice that darker shades towards the bottom of the screen are somewhat lighter than they should be. This doesn't affect pure black, but it does affect other shades that are slightly lighter than black, so lots of very dark shades will be affected by this. And towards the top of the screen, these darker shades appear deeper than they should, and that masks detail. And with this game, there are lots of vertical puzzles, and you have to look at rock textures and wall textures to work out if you can actually climb on them or not. And these can be masked towards the top of the screen, and I find I kind of have to lift my head a bit, or if I'm slouching in my chair it's made a bit worse. And this is typical for TN models, especially when they've got a screen this large. But it's not extreme on this model, and I wouldn't really say it affects playability, it just means you have to be a bit more careful about your posture. But I mean, this was an extreme example I've just given you. Generally, it's not something that most users are going to find bothersome. So as I mentioned, lower down the screen there's more detail than there should be. So it means that some elements in these dark scenes aren't as well masked as they should be, and they kind of stand out a little bit too much towards the bottom. However, very good thing to report compared to the older G-Sync models. There aren't really any particular visibility issues for the central mass of the screen. The gamma, as I've calibrated it here, is pretty much spot on for the centre of the screen. And there aren't any sort of colour processing issues which cause what users might refer to as banding or blockiness. And the Dell G-Sync models did suffer from that, even once you'd calibrated them so the central gamma is perfect. They still had these sort of issues with this blockiness and too much unintended detail. This model doesn't have that kind of issue, so that's going to be a real relief to some users. And although I'm showing you a game now, this is something which people find generally more noticeable with movies and particularly streamed content. They have what's known as compression artifacts, and these are part of the content itself, but they're supposed to be quite well blended into the rest of the dark scene. Whereas if they stand out too much because of gamma issues or because of other issues with the image, then they give this obvious blocky look and it kind of ruins the atmosphere. I've looked at lots of Netflix content on this monitor and I didn't notice that as an issue there. As I've noticed, the perceived gamma is lower down the screen though, so you do get a little bit of that sort of at the bottom of the screen, but overall it's really quite minor, especially if you compare to what you see even centrally on the G-Sync models. More specifically, that's the Dell S2719DG and the S2417DG. So these brighter elements, such as the light there, they stand out quite nicely against the dark surroundings. As I mentioned, the static contrast isn't particularly strong, so it doesn't really sort of pop out in that way. But it certainly is aided by the screen surface, which is light matte anti-glare and has a nice smooth finish. So these brighter elements don't have a grainy look to them, they look quite smooth. And although on the camera they just look like a big sort of ball of brightness, you can actually certainly see the detail levels quite nicely. So you can see the floodlight has a kind of grill in front of it, which you can see in real life, but you can't see that on the video, I'm afraid. And I do like this screen surface, it does make a big difference. I recently reviewed the AOC AG273QCG, which is an Agon G-Sync model with a similar but curved version of this panel, and that unfortunately did have a quite grainy matte screen surface, a medium matte anti-glare with not a particularly smooth finish, and the difference coming to this really is quite dramatic. It's something that I'm sensitive to and I bang on about endlessly in my reviews, but that's because I see it as something that's very important and has a fundamental impact on the image quality. I'm now going to talk about colour reproduction, and as usual I like to start this section off by looking at the Lagom tests for viewing angles. That's the website lagom.nl. And this has a text test which is very good for showing if a monitor has viewing angle weaknesses related to its gamma curve, and all TN models do have that. This model of course is no exception. Ideally this text would appear a nice blended grey throughout, whereas you can see there's a strong red tint, particularly towards the bottom of the screen or lower down the screen, but if you lower your head it becomes more of a kind of green tint, and it flashes between the two readily with vertical head movement. From a normal viewing position, which is sort of more or less there, you can see that there's a bit of the green striping, then it goes sort of blended grey, then orange, and then red. You can also see saturation shifts if you're viewing shades, and it's particularly obvious on this test because it has a solid big area of individual shade. In an ideal world, the shade would appear a solid bluish purple, whereas on TN models like this you can always see a pink hue creep in at various points, and you can see that again shift with head movement, but from a normal viewing position it looks a kind of bluish purple towards the top, but it quite readily transitions to a more pink hue. And this is because the perceived gamma is considerably higher at the top region of the screen versus the bottom. And you can see that with the pink block, or the red block I should say. It does appear quite pink towards the bottom of the screen, fairly vibrant red towards the top, and again shifts between the two with head movement. The green block appears quite a solid green, but it does appear more yellowish towards the bottom, and overall there is a kind of yellowish tint to the green colour, and that's because this doesn't have a particularly wide colour gamut, so it doesn't really appear as a true pure green. The blue block, as usual, is pretty solid, doesn't really have any clear differences. There can be some slight brightness variation according to uniformity on the panel, but my particular unit actually has very good uniformity, so it's actually a very good solid blue throughout. I'm now running Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. I've again got the camera mounted so it's sort of in line with the top third of the screen rather than the centre of the screen to better simulate the ergonomically correct viewing position. This monitor offers a bit of extension beyond sRGB for some green and some red shades and some orange shades and sort of yellowish shades. So if you look at the colour gamut representation on the written review, you'll see this extension. It's not extreme extension, but it's enough to give a little bit of extra vibrancy in places, and that's something that many users will quite like. I'm actually using this map not because it highlights any particular weaknesses well, but more because it shows some strengths quite well. It has lots of these very nice rich autumnal browns and red shades and some quite lush looking greens as well, and this monitor presents them all very nicely. And there are some saturation shifts, as I'd mentioned. So this green shade here, for example, it kind of appears richer green towards the top of the screen, kind of more yellowish towards the bottom, but this sort of difference is not as pronounced as I've seen on some TN models. I recently reviewed the ViewSonic XG240R, and that uses an old 2011 TN panel Full HD. Even though that monitor is smaller than this, so the viewing angle differences are potentially more extreme from a normal viewing position, it actually shows a much greater degree of saturation loss lower down the screen than this model. This is actually about as good as you'll see on a TN panel. And the screen surface also helps. This doesn't really come across on the video, but it does give a nice clear look to it, and it does enhance perceived vibrancy compared to a stronger matte screen surface. So there are certainly some really nice licks of sort of red and brown, some nice deep green shades, and as I mentioned, there's a bit of saturation loss lower down, but nothing extreme, and the overall look is definitely one that's rich and vibrant rather than washed out. One caveat to this is, at least with my unit, this doesn't apply to all units. I've gathered quite a bit of user feedback on this now, but my unit did unfortunately have gamma which was lower than it should be, lower than the intended 2.2 target. My unit was close to 2.0, so I've corrected that using an ICC profile. There isn't a way to correct that in the OSD. One of the presets actually had quite good gamma handling, actually very close to 2.2 target, and was quite nice overall. Only problem was it applied this annoying sharpness filter and you couldn't get rid of it. I mentioned that in the written review and also in the OSD video. So that was a bit of a pain in the backside, to be honest. So it meant that I have to use an ICC profile to correct the gamma and make some other corrections. And with this, the image is nice and rich. Without it, it doesn't look washed out. It still has decent richness in places, but I certainly feel it gives a nice edge in vibrancy to have the gamma correctly calibrated. By all means, try our profile if you want to. It's found in the calibration section of the written review, but be aware that there's differences between individual units and it's not necessarily going to be optimal for your unit. If you have to create a profile, it's always better to do it on your own unit, on your own system. So, I mean, this sort of painted green here is nice and vibrant. Again, a little bit more so towards the top of the screen, but not a dramatic difference. It certainly appears quite rich and eye-catching, regardless of where on the screen it's appearing. So there's not really much more to say about the colour reproduction. All I would say is, just as far as TN models go, this is one of the best ones out there for colour reproduction once it's set up correctly. I'm on Battlefield 5 again, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor uses a 155Hz panel, or more specifically it uses a 144Hz panel, and it has an overclock feature in the OSD which will enable 155Hz if you're using DisplayPort. What this means is the monitor is outputting around 2.6 times as much information every second as a 60Hz monitor, provided you've got a suitably high frame rate. So you can see my frame rate in the top right corner. It's more or less 155 frames a second. It's a few slight drops, but it's pretty much at 155. So this allows me to take maximum advantage of the monitor's refresh rate. And with this, you get what I call a very good connected feel. So when you interact with the game world, there's a certain smoothness, a certain fluidity with your movements translating to movements of the character and moving the position on the screen. And this is separate to input lag. Although input lag does affect the connected feel, the particular aspect of connected feel which is enhanced by increased refresh rate isn't something you'd get on a 60Hz monitor regardless of how good the input lag is. So there's definitely a certain feel which you can appreciate when you use a monitor like this, but it's very difficult to convey in a video or really explain. It's just something which lots of users sort of understand as soon as they've used this kind of monitor. Now, I did mention input lag. That is of course an important part of connected feel, and that is very low on this monitor. It doesn't have an issue with that, so that certainly aids the connected feel as well. The other aspect of the 155Hz refresh rate with suitably high frame rates is that you get a significant reduction in perceived blur. This is a concept explored in an article on responsiveness on the website and summarised in the written review. Perceived blur is a very important concept to understand. It has two main components to it. One of them is linked to the refresh rate very closely, and that is that it reduces eye movement, because it's actually the movement of your eyes whilst you're tracking motion on a screen that creates most of the blur you'll see on a modern monitor. So the 155Hz at 155 frames a second, it gives you a nice edge in perceived blur compared to lower frame rate. If you're comparing it to 60Hz, the difference to me is very noticeable indeed. 100Hz, also a nice edge. But if you're comparing it to 144Hz, it's only really a slight difference. And also the connected feel I mentioned before, really a very slight difference compared to 144Hz at 144 frames a second. So it's a sort of a bit of a bonus, this 155Hz, but it's nothing revolutionary. I can tell the difference between sort of 144 and 165Hz a bit more readily. That's, as maths will tell you, it's more of a significant difference there. I'd wager that in a blind test on this model between 144Hz and 155Hz, I'd probably struggle to notice much of a difference, to be fair. Moving on then, pixel responsiveness is another important aspect of perceived blur. This monitor has very snappy pixel responses overall, so it makes very good use of the 155Hz refresh rate. That is, provided you're using the fast setting. There are various different response time settings, as I've gone through in the written review and also the OSD video. So these are found in the game section of the OSD menu. As you can see, I've got the overclock feature enabled, and you need that for the 155Hz. So it's here listed: response time, fast, normal and super fast. Super fast is horrible, it gives you a massive amount of overshoot. I'll show you that in a little bit. If you have the response time set to normal, I feel that the pixel responsiveness really is too weak for a solid 155Hz performance. In fact, it's too weak for really any sort of triple-digit frame rate and refresh rate combination. So it's not bad. I mean, it's not bad if you compare, for example, to a VA model. There aren't any really distinct weaknesses like you'd get there with a sort of smeary trailing, but there's what I call moderate powdery trailing. And it is enough to just sort of increase perceived blur and give you a kind of look which you wouldn't expect from a fast TN model. And it's quite widespread, actually it's very widespread, this sort of slight powdery trailing. You might not notice it in isolation, but it does give an increase to perceived blur overall, and I don't find that's an acceptable trade-off on this kind of model. So I prefer to use the fast setting. And what this does, it cuts down on the perceived blur nicely. It really gives a very low level of perceived blur, but there is some overshoot in places. As you'll know from my review of the Dell S2719DG, the older 27-inch G-Sync model, there was a lot of overshoot there, and it was very widespread and pretty obvious. On this model, it isn't that bad, but there are some fairly strong examples of it still. So behind this tree here, there's sort of a slight light trailing, a bright trail of overshoot, which is brighter than most of the background colour, or certainly brighter than the tree trunk, so it kind of stands out a bit. It's not particularly eye-catching, that example. There's also a sort of a bright trail behind the light up here, and again, not supremely strong. Actually, the strongest overshoot on this model happens between high contrast transitions, where you've got very light shades, white for example, against really dark backgrounds. So I can see a kind of little bright green fringe around where it says pick up a letter, but it's certainly not extreme. I actually find the overshoot most noticeable when I'm on the desktop, because they have black to white transitions and vice versa. So when you've got, for example, black text against a white background, you can see this fairly colourful overshoot trailing, sort of bright blue in places, and I find that quite eye-catching. But when I'm gaming, I generally don't find it eye-catching. Certainly when I'm immersed in a game, especially when I'm playing a game like this, multiplayer, I'm sort of playing slightly competitively, I really don't get bothered at all by this overshoot. I get more bothered by the extra perceived blur when I'm using the normal setting. So even with this overshoot, I do prefer to use the fast setting. I'm on a different scene on Battlefield 5 because I've noticed some more obvious overshoot here, but it's not extreme at this high refresh rate, high frame rate, 155 Hz, but there is some fairly bright trailing behind this wood here, and that's obviously not a high contrast transition. I mean, you could consider it that because it does have some darker elements in the wood, but for the most part this is actually between brighter shades, and you can see sort of a bright, or I can see a slightly bright blue trail. You can see it behind that tree as well, with the sky in the background. You can also see it on that tree there. It actually looks like a kind of flickering. You can probably see that on the monitor, but that's actually a bit of overshoot causing that effect. But it's not extreme. And these are sort of the more obvious examples I could find in this game, and I've played other games as well, and nothing really stood out in a blindingly obvious way, but I would have preferred that things were more like they are on the Dell S2719DGF, which offers really very good pixel responsiveness without any real obvious overshoot. This monitor also supports adaptive sync, which means you can use AMD FreeSync. It also means that you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, as I'm doing right now. I've got this monitor connected to an NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti. And what this does is it allows the monitor to adjust its refresh rate according to the frame rate of the content. If you don't do that, you either get stuttering if you've got VSync on, or you get tearing if you've got VSync off. Even if the frame rate departs just slightly from the refresh rate, you get these things. And for sensitive users like me, it's really quite an obvious thing and quite a jarring thing. And it's very nice not having the issues from this sort of mismatch. So I've got it running at a pretty solid 155 frames a second now, so the technology doesn't really come into play. There are some slight dips though, and it's nice not getting the tearing and stuttering. I've now increased my graphics settings so that the frame rate's dipped a bit, and I've also put the frame rate counter from the monitor itself, which is displayed in the top left. And as you can see, it's actually quite a distracting frame rate counter. It updates extremely quickly as the refresh rate of the monitor changes. It's actually a refresh rate display rather than a frame rate display. So when you've got FreeSync active on the monitor or you're using adaptive sync, it means that that is actually displaying your frame rate if you're within the variable refresh rate range. I'll come on to that very shortly. But I just wanted to show you this counter because it's crazy how quickly it adjusts, and it's also makes it quite difficult to see exactly what it's showing. So I don't think it's a very well thought out refresh rate counter, to be honest. But basically, it's around 100 frames a second, a bit of fluctuation either side. And now I get a bit of a drop off in connected feel, and the perceived blur is not as good as it was at the much higher frame rate, but it's still decent. I mean, it's still a triple digit frame rate, and you do get a good level of connected feel, you get good perceived blur, and because I've got adaptive sync active, I don't get tearing and stuttering from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. You can get stuttering or hitching from various other issues with game engines or your system, all sorts of different issues there, but it certainly reduces your stuttering and eliminates tearing from refresh rate and frame rate mismatches. This technology on this model works below 100 Hz, 100 frames a second as well. So I'm going to increase my graphics settings further. I've increased the graphics settings further, and you can see it's around 80 frames a second, some dips below that to around 70 frames a second. And what this means is the connected feel isn't as good anymore, the perceived blur is significantly higher than the much higher frame rates, but I don't get the tearing and stuttering because Adaptive Sync's doing its thing still. That's really nice. One thing to note though, and this is a common complaint with FreeSync models in general, the overshoot is a lot more noticeable now at these lower refresh rates. So this will most likely come out quite cleanly on the video now. You'll see a sort of bright trail behind the tree there, although I now said that it probably won't come out on the video, but you can certainly, or I can certainly see a very bright trail of overshoot behind the tree and behind the post as well. It's really quite noticeable behind that tree. And this increases more if the refresh rate dips even lower. So I've just nudged up the detail levels ever so slightly to make this overshoot a little bit stronger again, sort of around 60 frames a second sometimes. And this is something where G-Sync models actually do a lot better than FreeSync models in general. They use something which NVIDIA call variable overdrive, and that means that as the refresh rate drops, because your frame rate's dropping, the overdrive is slackened off, and that's very important. FreeSync models, more often than not, they will simply have the overdrive tuned to 144 Hz, or at least something which will work nicely at very high refresh rates. So in this case, perhaps 155 Hz, 144 Hz. But as it drops, certainly into the double digits and into the lower or mid double digits, you get really strong overshoot. The voltage surges used for the overdrive are just far too strong for these lower refresh rates, and it just messes things up. And that's a very common issue with FreeSync models. And as I said, I'm using NVIDIA G-Sync compatible mode, but it's still Adaptive Sync and it still has the same sort of overdrive technology. It doesn't actually change that. So do be aware of that. You could use the normal setting. I'm not going to show that now. Actually, okay, I will show that now very briefly. So if you're often at this kind of double-digit sort of mid-level frame rate, around 60 or anything really below 80 frames a second, and the overshoot becomes pretty prominent, you might want to use the normal setting because it does reduce the overshoot significantly. But there is still, even at these sort of lower frame rates, lower refresh rates, there's still some sort of powdery trailing, as I call it, and it does increase perceived blur. What I've done now is I've got the monitor set to the fast setting, and I've also increased the graphics so that it will dip a bit below 60 frames a second. Now, there's a slight divergence here between how the monitor acts when you're using an NVIDIA GPU with Adaptive Sync versus an AMD GPU with FreeSync. When it goes below 60 frames a second on my NVIDIA GPU, what happens is the monitor will stick to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate. So you can see that counter now. It sort of fluctuates between 110, you might have just seen that, around there, and 55. And if you look at the frame rate counter itself, it's around 55. The reason for this is basically the floor operation is 55 Hz on the NVIDIA system. It actually goes down to 40 Hz with AMD's implementation. So there is a bit of a difference there, but on either system, when it goes below that floor, what happens is the refresh rate will stick to a multiple of the frame rate, and that gets rid of tearing and stuttering from refresh rate and frame rate mismatches, which you'd get when things don't neatly divide that way. So it does work. LFC, it's called, low frame rate compensation on AMD systems. NVIDIA use something very similar. It's just that when it kicks in is different on the NVIDIA system. 55 Hz versus 40 Hz, or 55 frames a second versus 40 frames a second. And there is a slight sort of stuttering when it does kick in or when it deactivates, but that's not really particularly obvious to me, and it's not really something I'd worry about unless you're frequently going below and above the boundary. And just to wrap up this section, I've got my graphics settings so that I'm getting a nice solid 155 frames a second or more or less now, and I've got the monitor set to fast. There isn't really very obvious overshoot again, there are some examples of it, but compared to what I've just shown you at the much lower frame rates and refresh rates, it's really nothing to write home about. If, however, you decide to use the ultra fast settings, I haven't shown you that yet, or super fast, sorry, it's called super fast, there's then ridiculous levels of overshoot, way stronger than I was showing you in any example before. So essentially this setting is completely unusable, and it's also completely pointless because the fast setting already tunes things very nicely to give you really no clear conventional trailing at all. There's some overshoot as I've mentioned, but it's much weaker than with this ultra fast or super fast setting. To wrap up then, I like the overall design of the monitor because there aren't any sort of flashy or flamboyant gaming type features or distracting colours. It has quite a sensible look, a mixture of matte black plastic, but some slightly unusual colours, unusual in a good way, not sort of eye-catching and weird, but just a little bit different. Something Dell call Recon Blue, used for the stand and the rear of the monitor, and that's a kind of bluish grey, which is a little bit different to the more neutral grey that's usually used, so that's kind of nice. The little metallic-y looking Dell logo is a nice touch as well, a little bit different there. Generally doesn't really catch the eye, but you know, you can, when you're looking at it, notice it's a little bit different to usual. I also like that the stand is fully ergonomically flexible, but it doesn't have the sort of ridiculous base design that some models have, so it doesn't take up a massive amount of desk space either. In terms of contrast, largely as I'd expect from a decent TN model, a little bit lower than 1000:1 once I'd made the adjustments for my test settings, but one thing I was quite pleased to see was that it didn't have the issue that the older G-Sync models had and some other models have, particularly TN models, in that it didn't display far too much detail in dark areas, and that would give issues, particularly when you're looking at movies. You'd see compression artifacts, as they're called, far too obvious. You'd see in games as well, there are these slight details which should be quite well masked, which just come out in an obvious way on these G-Sync models or these other TN models I'm talking about. Not just TN models, but various models can have this issue. This model didn't have that issue, so the central bulk of the screen, when you're observing dark content, it looks more or less as it should, quite well blended. There are some perceived gamma shifts, as I explore in the review, up and down the screen in particular, some differences, and that can affect detail levels. There isn't IPS glow or anything like that because it's a TN panel, so the overall atmosphere in dark scenes was reasonable. Again, not super strong static contrast. I also liked the screen surface, light matte anti-glare, without a rough surface texture, so things didn't look overly grainy, and this helps with perceived clarity, vibrancy, that kind of thing. So I'm quite fond of the screen surface they used, similar to the G-Sync models, so it's a nice sort of compromise between traditional matte and glossy, I feel. Moving on to colour reproduction. This monitor did have some issues with gamma, or at least my unit did, and not everyone will have these issues. There was a bit of inter-unit variation, so I had to apply an ICC profile to correct this. But once I'd done that, the image was rich overall, it was quite vibrant in places, and it really looked as good as I've seen from any TN model. The colour consistency as a TN model, the perceived gamma shifts, they do affect the saturation levels, so it's a bit lower down the screen, higher and deeper looking higher up the screen, but again overall rich, and the loss of saturation lower down the screen is not as extreme as I've seen on some TN models, even ones with smaller screens than this. The colour gamut extends a little bit beyond sRGB, so that gave a little bit of extra vibrancy in places, not as much as a much wider colour gamut would give, but I do feel it gives a little bit of an edge compared to a monitor tracking sRGB very closely. The responsiveness, really overall very impressive on this model. 155Hz refresh rate put to very good use, nice low input lag, really snappy pixel responses. There was some overshoot, and I found actually that was more noticeable on the desktop in general, but it wasn't really particularly bothersome when I was gaming. I did notice it, but not as strong as on the S2719DG, but certainly stronger than the S2417DG, all these in their optimal settings. The monitor also supports adaptive sync, so I could use FreeSync with my AMD GPU, and I could use adaptive sync with my NVIDIA GPU using G-Sync compatible mode. and it worked in a very similar way on both of these systems. A slight difference to the floor of operation, but with both systems there was low frame rate compensation or something similar, which kind of got rid of tearing and stuttering with that as well. But as I often observe with FreeSync models, the overshoot did become more obvious at these lower frame rates, particularly the double-digit frame rates. As I say, this is a common complaint to have with FreeSync models. So that's really all there is to the Dell S2719DGF. Be sure to check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.